If you think a plastic pool key can't ruin your life, you've never met someone like Rebecca Whitmore. The gate buzzed, flashed red, and stayed locked, the metal latch clicking like it was rejecting me on purpose, like it knew something I didn't. And for a second all I could smell was chlorine thick in the heat and sunscreen melting off people's skin, while every conversation around the pool just stopped. Kids froze mid-splash, someone turned down their Bluetooth speaker, and I felt it. That shift, when a normal afternoon turns into a scene. I looked down at the key fob in my hand, the same one I'd used every day since moving in 3 weeks ago, still warm from my palm, still perfectly fine, and then I looked up at her. Rebecca stood by the gate like she owned not just the pool, but the air around it, sunglasses perched high, clipboard tucked against her chest, lips pressed into that tight, rehearsed smile HOA presidents were when they're about to make an example out of someone. "Access revoked," she said, loud enough for at least 30 people to hear, her voice cutting clean through the humid afternoon like she'd been waiting all day to say it. I asked her why, calm, steady, because that's what you do when you don't want to give someone like her exactly what she's fishing for, and she tilted her head just slightly, like I'd already disappointed her. "Violation of community rules," she said, tapping the clipboard like the answer lived there, like it was official just because she said it was. I hadn't violated anything, not the parking guidelines, not the trash schedule, not even the ridiculous lawn height rule she'd already warned 2 other neighbors about this week. And I could feel eyes on me now, neighbors trying to piece together what I'd done wrong, deciding quietly whether I deserved this. "I'd like to see that in writing," I said, still calm, still giving her a chance to step back, but instead she smiled wider, like I'd just stepped exactly where she wanted me to. "Oh, you will," she said, pulling out her phone, already dialing, already turning this into something bigger. That's when I realized the pool key was never the point. She wasn't trying to enforce a rule, she was staging a moment. 10 minutes later, the low hum of a patrol SUV rolled into the lot, tires crunching slow over the asphalt, and you could feel the temperature drop even though the sun was still beating down at 90 degrees. Deputy Ryan Whitmore stepped out like he'd done this 100 times, one hand resting near his belt, scanning the scene, then locking onto me like he already knew who I was supposed to be. Not a neighbor, not a resident, a problem. Rebecca walked up to him, close enough to look like this was routine, like they did this together, like power in this neighborhood came in pairs, and she gestured toward me without even looking back. "That's him," she said, casual, dismissive, like I wasn't standing right there hearing every word. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I just stood there with the useless key fob in my hand, feeling the weight of 30 silent witnesses, watching how fast a normal day could turn into something else entirely. Ryan approached, slow, measured, not aggressive, not friendly either, just controlled, the kind of presence meant to remind you who holds authority here. "Sir, we've had a complaint," he said, and I almost laughed because of course they had, because this whole thing had been building to that exact line. A complaint. About what? He didn't say. He didn't need to. The uniform did the talking, the badge did the talking, the way everyone around us stayed quiet did the talking. Rebecca folded her arms, satisfied now, like the show had officially started, like the outcome was already decided. And the craziest part? She really believed it was. She thought I was just another quiet guy who moved in, kept to himself, someone easy to push, easy to corner, someone who'd apologize just to make it stop. She didn't know why I chose this neighborhood. She didn't know why I kept my head down. And she definitely didn't know that the moment that gate turned red, she stopped being the one in control. I could feel the shift before he even said another word, that quiet pressure that comes when someone decides you are already guilty and the rest is just procedure. And Ryan stood there looking at me like I was a line item on a report he had already filed in his head. "I am going to need you to step away from the gate," he said, comment. Even, like this was routine, like we were not standing in front of half the neighborhood, while his wife watched from 5 feet away with that same satisfied smile. I did not move right away, not because I was refusing, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to push this, how much of this was performance and how much was habit. The metal gate hummed again behind me as someone inside swiped their key and slipped through, avoiding eye contact, and I noticed how quickly people adjusted, how fast they decided it was safer to pretend nothing was happening. That told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on. Sir, Ryan added, a little firmer this time, and I nodded, taking one slow step back, then another, giving him exactly what he wanted without giving him anything else. Rebecca shifted her weight, arms still folded, watching me like she expected a reaction, like she was waiting for me to snap so she could justify the entire scene she had just created. But I did not snap. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting them fill it with their own assumptions. There have been complaints, Ryan continued, glancing briefly at Rebecca before looking back at me. And that was the first crack, small but obvious, because he did not say what the complaint was, and he did not ask me for my side. He just delivered the line like it had been handed to him. About what exactly? I asked, keeping my voice level, not challenging, not defensive, just precise. Rebecca answered before he could. Unauthorized use of community amenities, she said, like she had rehearsed it, like she had been waiting to say those exact words in front of an audience. I almost smiled, because that was not how any of this worked, not according to the actual HOA bylaws I had already read twice since moving in, not according to the access logs I knew existed for every single key fob issued in this community. But they did not think I knew that. They thought I was new, quiet, easy to push into compliance. I have lived here for 3 weeks, I said. This is my assigned key. I held it up slightly, not aggressively, just enough for it to catch the light, a small piece of plastic that suddenly seemed to carry a lot more weight than it should. Ryan looked at it, then back at me, and for a second I could see the hesitation, the part of him that knew something about this was off, but it passed quickly, replaced by that same controlled neutrality. You can take that up with the homeowners association, he said, stepping just a little closer, enough to make it clear the conversation was over on his terms. Rebecca's smile widened just a fraction, like she had just won something. We will be sending formal notice, she added, tapping her clipboard again, making sure everyone heard it. Formal notice. Violation. Complaint. They were building a narrative in real time, layering words until it sounded official enough that no one would question it. I glanced around at the pool, at the people who had already gone back to their chairs, their conversations quieter now, their eyes still flicking over every few seconds, and I realized this was not just about me being denied access. This was about control, about reminding everyone else what happened when you did not fall in line. Understood, I said, because sometimes the fastest way to end a scene is to let the other person believe they have already won. Ryan gave a short nod, satisfied, and stepped back, the invisible boundary resetting as quickly as it had formed. Rebecca turned away first, already talking to someone else like nothing had happened, like I had just been another task checked off her list. But as I walked away from the gate, the heat pressing down, the smell of chlorine still clinging to the air, I started replaying every detail, every word, every glance, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this had not been spontaneous. The key had not just stopped working. It had been turned off. Manually. Intentionally. And if she could do that without a record, or worse, if she thought she could, then this was not just about a pool. This was about access, control, and systems that were being used in ways they were never supposed to be used. By the time I reached my car, the scene behind me already fading back into normal life, I knew one thing for sure. Rebecca Whitmore believed she had just put me in my place. She had no idea. She had just given me exactly what I needed. I did not go back inside right away. I just sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle while the heat built up behind the glass, because moments like that tell you more than any report ever could if you were paying attention. The smell of chlorine still clung to my shirt, faint but sharp, like a reminder that what just happened was not random. It was structured, planned, executed with confidence. I replayed Rebecca's words, the timing of her call, the way Ryan arrived too quickly, too prepared, and most of all the way neither of them ever questioned the situation. That was the part that mattered. Not the accusation, not the scene, the certainty. People who follow rules ask questions. People who bend them skip straight to enforcement. I pulled the key fob from my pocket and turned it over slowly, running my thumb across the smooth plastic, knowing exactly how these systems worked, how every scan, every denial, every change left a trace somewhere, even if the person using it thought it did not. There is always a log. There is always a timestamp. And if there is a timestamp, there is a story. I stepped out of the car and headed back toward my unit, the pavement radiating heat through the soles of my shoes, the neighborhood already pretending everything was normal again, garage doors opening, someone mowing a lawn 2 houses down, the steady rhythm of suburban life resetting itself like nothing had just happened at that pool gate. That was fine. I preferred it that way. Quiet environments make louder patterns. Inside my place, the air conditioning hummed low and steady, a sharp contrast to the heat outside, and I set the key fob down on the kitchen counter like it was evidence, not because it was dramatic, but because that is how I think. Objects are never just objects. They are entry points. I opened my laptop and connected to the community network. Nothing complicated, nothing invasive, just the standard resident access that every homeowner here had. The same access Rebecca assumed no one would ever question. The HOA portal loaded slowly, a clean interface with tabs for billing, maintenance requests, community announcements, and access management, the last one sitting there quietly like it did not matter, like it was just another administrative tool. But that was where the truth usually lived. Systems like this are designed to be convenient, not secure, especially when the people running them believe authority is enough protection. I navigated through the menus, not rushing, just observing, noting how permissions were structured, who had administrative rights, how changes were recorded. It did not take long to find the section tied to amenity access. Pool, gym, clubhouse. Each key fob assigned, each scan recorded. Clean, organized, predictable. Exactly what I expected. I entered my unit number and there it was, my key, active, assigned correctly, no violations listed, no restrictions noted. On paper, everything was normal. But paper is not where real actions happen. I switched to the activity logs, filtering by date, narrowing it down to the last 48 hours, and that is when the first inconsistency showed up. A manual override entry. Not a scheduled update. Not an automated flag. A direct administrative action tied to my key. Time stamped less than 15 minutes before I reached the pool gate. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, because that was the moment the story stopped being about misunderstanding and became something else entirely. Someone with administrative access had gone in, selected my key, and disabled it just before I tried to use it. That was not enforcement. That was targeting. I checked the user ID attached to the action, a generic admin label, nothing personal, nothing obvious, but even that told me something. People who know what they are doing leave clean signatures. People who think they are untouchable do not bother. I kept digging, cross-referencing other recent changes, and a pattern started to form. A handful of keys had been modified over the past month, always around the same times, always tied to minor disputes listed in community notes, parking complaints, noise complaints, small things that somehow escalated into access restrictions. Rebecca was not just managing the HOA. She was using the system as leverage. And Ryan's presence earlier? That was reinforcement. Authority layered on top of authority until no one pushed back. I closed the laptop slowly, not because I was done, but because I had seen enough for now. The key on the counter was no longer just a piece of plastic. It was proof that the line had already been crossed. And the moment someone crosses that line, they stop controlling the outcome. They just do not know it yet. The email hit my inbox at exactly 7:12 p.m., subject line in all caps like it was trying to shout through the screen, notice of violation, and for a moment I just stared at it without opening it, letting that familiar pattern settle in, because timing like that is never accidental. Early evening, when people are home, when they check their phones, when the message has the highest chance of being seen and talked about. I opened it slowly, reading every word, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to hear her voice inside it, and it was all there. The same tone, the same structure, the same confidence. Unauthorized use of community amenities. Failure to comply with HOA regulations. Potential escalation if noncompliance continues. It was written like a template, but the intent behind it was personal. There was no attached evidence, no specific incident listed, just broad language designed to sound official enough that most people would not question it. That was the trick. Make it look formal, and it becomes real to everyone who reads it. I leaned back in my chair, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the room, and I could already see how this played out for most residents. They would get this email, feel that immediate pressure, maybe a little fear, and then they would comply. Apologize. Pay whatever fee came next. Stay quiet. That is how systems like this sustain themselves. Not through force, but through assumption. I scrolled further down and saw the sender details, a generic HOA administrative address. But the reply to field was different. Direct. Personal. Rebecca Whitmore. That was the second mistake. People who understand process keep distance between action and identity. People who believe they cannot be challenged attach their name without thinking twice. I set the phone down and stood up, walking toward the window, looking out over the street where everything still looked calm, lights turning on one by one as the sun dropped lower, neighbors moving through their routines like nothing had shifted. But it had. The moment she sent that email, she moved this from a public scene to a documented action. That meant there was now a record, and records can be examined. A soft knock broke the quiet, just 2 taps, measured, deliberate, not loud enough to alarm, but clear enough that it was not optional. I did not rush. I walked to the door and opened it just enough to see Ryan standing there. No cruiser this time, no flashing lights, just him in plain clothes, hands relaxed, posture casual in a way that was too controlled to be natural. "Evening," he said, like we were neighbors having a normal conversation, like the scene at the pool had never happened. I nodded once, waiting, letting him decide how he wanted to frame this. "Just wanted to follow up," he continued, voice low, almost friendly, but there was a weight behind it, the kind that does not need to be loud to be understood. Things can get complicated when HOA issues escalate. There it was. Not a threat. Not officially. Just a suggestion wrapped in concern. I kept my expression neutral, giving him nothing to push against. "I read the notice," I said. "I will respond through the proper channel." He studied me for a second, like he was trying to figure out why I was not reacting the way he expected, why I was not defensive or frustrated or trying to explain myself. That was the moment people like him usually adjust, either softening or pressing harder, depending on what they think will work. He chose to soften. "That is probably best," he said, stepping back slightly, already disengaging. "Just trying to keep things smooth around here." Smooth. That word lingered after he turned and walked away, because smooth does not mean fair. It means quiet. It means controlled. It means no disruptions to the way things are already being run. I closed the door and stood there for a second, listening to his footsteps fade. Then I walked back to the counter where the key fob still sat, exactly where I left it. Earlier that day, it had been denied access at a gate. Now it was tied to an official violation notice and an informal visit from a deputy. The escalation was clean, efficient, and deliberate, which meant it was repeatable, which meant it had likely happened before. I picked up the key again, turning it in my hand, and for the first time since this started, I let myself acknowledge what this really was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a personality conflict. A system, being used in ways it was never designed for, backed by just enough authority to keep anyone from questioning it. Rebecca thought she had just tightened control. Ryan thought he had just reinforced it. But what they actually did was create a chain. And chains, when you follow them carefully, always lead somewhere. The next morning started quiet. Almost too quiet, like the neighborhood was holding its breath after what happened the day before, and that kind of silence usually means people are watching, just not openly. I stepped outside just after 8 a.m., the air still cool before the heat settled in, and I noticed something immediately that most people would have missed. The camera mounted near the clubhouse entrance had been adjusted. Not replaced, not repaired, just angled slightly differently, enough to widen its field of view toward the walkway that led past my unit. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you had seen it before, but I had. Systems leave fingerprints, and so do the people who control them. I kept walking like I did not notice, keys in hand, moving at the same pace I always did, because the worst thing you can do when someone is observing you is show them you are aware of it. The goal is to let them keep believing they are the only ones paying attention. As I passed the mailbox cluster, I saw 2 neighbors standing there, their conversation dropping just a fraction as I approached, not enough to be obvious, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. Word had spread, not the truth, but the version Rebecca wanted. That I had violated something. That I was being handled. That the system was working exactly as intended. I nodded politely, checked my mailbox, and found exactly what I expected. Another envelope. HOA letterhead. Clean, official, designed to look like authority on paper. I opened it right there, not because I needed to, but because timing matters, and so does visibility. Inside was a printed version of the email from last night, expanded with more formal language, a reference to potential fines, and a scheduled review if the issue was not resolved. Still no evidence. Still no specifics. Just pressure. That was the pattern. Build enough weight around a claim, and eventually people stop asking if the claim is real. I folded the letter neatly and slid it back into the envelope, then walked toward the clubhouse instead of my car, keeping my movements deliberate, predictable, giving anyone watching exactly what they expected to see. A resident complying. A resident following process. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper. That standard administrative scent that tells you nothing has changed here in years except the people running it. The front desk was empty, but the office door behind it was slightly open, and I could hear Rebecca's voice inside, low, controlled, speaking to someone on the phone. I did not stop. I walked past like I had a reason to be there, like I belonged, because hesitation is what draws attention. The community bulletin board sat along the far wall, covered in notices, event flyers, and printed policies, and I took my time reading through them, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted to see what had been added recently. There it was. A new notice about amenity compliance enforcement, dated just 2 days ago. Broad language. No specifics. Designed to justify exactly what had happened to me without ever mentioning it directly. That was not reactive. That was preemptive. She had set the stage before the incident even occurred. I could hear her footsteps before I saw her, the quick, confident rhythm of someone who expects control in every room she walks into. "Ethan," she said, like we were on a first-name basis now, like the scene at the pool had somehow given her that right. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze, calm, neutral, giving her nothing she could use. "Rebecca," I replied, matching her tone exactly. She stepped closer, not too close, just enough to establish presence, clipboard in hand again, like it was part of her identity. "I trust you received the notice," she said, tilting her head slightly, watching for a reaction. I nodded once. I did. She waited, expecting more, expecting explanation or defense, but I did not offer either. Silence can be uncomfortable for people who rely on control, because it gives them nothing to push against. "Good," she said after a second, filling the gap herself. "Then you understand the importance of resolving this quickly." There it was again. Not information. Not process. Pressure. I glanced briefly toward the bulletin board, then back at her. "I understand the process," I said, choosing each word carefully. Because words matter more than tone in moments like this. For a split second, something shifted in her expression, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. Recognition. Not of what I was, but of what I was not. I was not reacting the way she expected. I was not playing the role she had already assigned to me. That was the second crack. Small, but growing. She straightened slightly, adjusting her grip on the clipboard, recalibrating. "We expect full cooperation," she added, her voice tightening just a fraction. I held her gaze, steady, calm, and for the first time since this started, I saw it clearly. She did not just believe she was right. She believed she was protected. By the system. By her position. By her husband. And that belief was exactly what made this predictable. "You will have it," I said, and I meant it, just not in the way she thought. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse without looking back, the morning sun already warming the pavement, the adjusted camera catching my movement as I passed through its new field of view. Everything was aligning now. The logs. The notices. The timing. The behavior. This was no longer a question of what was happening. It was a question of how far it went. And more importantly, how many times it had already happened before. By the time I got back inside, everything had already shifted from observation to confirmation, and that is a line you do not cross unless you are ready to follow it all the way through. I set my keys down in the same spot as before, the small plastic fob catching the light again, and this time it did not look like something I needed to fix, it looked like something I needed to document. I opened my laptop and pulled up the HOA portal again, but this time I was not just browsing, I was mapping. Every tab, every permission level, every administrative pathway, all of it laid out piece by piece until the structure became clear. Systems are predictable when you understand how they are built, and this one was no different. It was designed for convenience, not accountability, and that made it easy to use and even easier to misuse. I started with the access logs again, expanding the time window beyond my own. Incident, going back 30 days, then 60, then 90, watching the entries stack up in clean rows that looked harmless until you knew what to look for. Manual overrides. Repeated patterns. The same time blocks appearing again and again, late afternoon, early evening, moments when people were most likely to be using amenities. That was not random. That was strategic. I cross-referenced those timestamps with community notes, pulling up archive notices, complaint summaries, anything that mentioned disputes, and the overlap was almost perfect. Someone complains. Shortly after, a key gets restricted. No formal hearing. No documented review. Just a quiet change in the system followed by a formal notice that made it look legitimate after the fact. That was the structure. That was the method. I leaned back slightly, letting the pattern settle, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This was not about enforcement. It was about control disguised as process. I opened a new document and began logging everything, not for memory, but for sequence, because sequence is what turns scattered details into evidence. Time, date, action, user ID, corresponding notice. Clean, organized, repeatable. That is what matters. Not what happened once, but what can be shown to happen consistently. The more I built it out, the clearer it became that I was not looking at a single incident. I was looking at a system that had been quietly adjusted to serve one person's authority, reinforced by someone else's badge, and accepted by everyone else because it had never been challenged properly. I pulled up the user permissions again, focusing on administrative roles, and there it was, the same generic account tied to most of the overrides, but buried deeper in the logs were traces of individual access sessions, subtle, but enough to connect timing with presence. Rebecca had the access. That part was obvious. But there were also logins tied to external devices at times that aligned with Ryan's off-duty hours. Not direct proof, not yet, but enough to suggest coordination. That was the difference between suspicion and direction. I saved copies of everything I could access through normal means, keeping it clean, keeping it within the boundaries that made it usable later, because how you collect information matters just as much as what you collect. Then I moved to the next layer. Cameras. Not the footage itself, not yet, but the system logs. That tracked adjustments, angle changes, maintenance entries. The same camera I noticed that morning had a recorded adjustment timestamp. Early, before most people were awake. And it aligned with one of the access overrides from the night before. That was not coincidence. That was preparation. I closed that window and sat still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the room, because this was the point where most people would react. Confront, accuse, demand answers. But that is not how you dismantle something like this. You do not interrupt it. You let it continue. You let it reveal itself fully, and then you present it in a way that cannot be ignored or explained away. I reached for my phone and opened the HOA contact thread, typing out a response to the violation notice, keeping it formal, measured, exactly what they would expect. A request for documentation. A request for the specific rule cited. A request for the process by which my access was restricted. Nothing aggressive. Nothing emotional. Just enough to force them to respond within their own framework. I sent it and set the phone down, knowing it would not resolve anything immediately, but it would add another layer to the record. Every interaction from this point forward would be part of the chain. Every response would either follow the rules or expose where they were being bent. I glanced once more at the key fob on the counter, then back at the screen where the logs were still open, rows of data that most people would never look at twice. To them, this was invisible. To me, it was already telling a story. And the more I followed it, the clearer one thing became. Rebecca believed she controlled the system. Ryan believed he could support it without consequence. But neither of them understood the difference between using a system and being recorded by it. And that difference was about to matter more than anything else. The reply came faster than I expected, not immediate, but fast enough to tell me they were watching closely, and that alone was useful. 11:43 a.m. Subject line clean, professional, structured to look like compliance, but the content told a different story. They acknowledged my request, confirmed receipt, and then redirected. Not denied. Not clarified. Redirected. Further documentation will be provided during the scheduled review process. That was their move. Delay specifics. Maintain pressure. Keep everything just out of reach until they controlled the setting. I read it twice. Then once more, not for meaning, but for tone, because tone reveals intent, and this one was careful, controlled. But underneath it, there was something else. Adjustment. They were recalibrating, which meant they had started to notice something was not going the way they expected. That was good. I closed the email and checked the portal again, not because I needed new information, but because I wanted to see if anything had changed after my request. Small things matter. Systems react in subtle ways when they are being watched. And there it was. Another entry. Not tied to my key this time, but to the administrative logs themselves. A permissions review. Quiet. Recent. Less than 30 minutes after I sent my response. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, because that confirmed it. They were not just managing residents anymore. They were managing visibility. Someone had gone in and adjusted who could see what, likely tightening access, possibly trying to limit exposure. That is what people do when they realize the system might be looked at more closely than they are used to. They do not fix the issue. They try to hide it better. I opened a fresh document and added the new entry to my sequence, time, action, scope, noting the proximity to my email, building the timeline out further. It was getting cleaner now. Clearer. Not just a pattern of behavior, but a reaction to pressure. And reactions are harder to justify than actions. I stood up and walked toward the window again, looking out over the same quiet street, same routine, same normal surface that had not changed, but underneath it, everything was shifting. Rebecca thought she was tightening control. In reality, she was leaving more traces. The afternoon moved slowly after that, deliberately, like both sides were waiting for the next move without acknowledging it. Around 3:15 p.m., another message came through, this time not email, but a notification from the HOA app. Scheduled review meeting. Tomorrow, 6 p.m. Location, clubhouse conference room. That was faster than standard procedure. Normally these things take days, sometimes weeks. But this was accelerated. That meant urgency. And urgency usually means pressure from inside, not outside. They wanted to contain this before it expanded. I accepted the meeting without hesitation. Not because I was complying, but because this was exactly where this needed to go. Controlled environment. Documented setting. Multiple parties present. That is where systems either hold up or collapse. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing, not in the way most people would expect, not rehearsing arguments or building defenses, but organizing sequence, refining clarity, making sure every piece of information connected cleanly to the next. Because the moment of presentation is not about volume. It is about precision. You do not overwhelm. You align. Every timestamp, every log, every notice, every adjustment, all of it needs to form a line that cannot be broken once it is seen. As the sun dropped lower, casting long shadows across the street, I stepped outside again, just briefly, just enough to confirm one more detail. The camera near the clubhouse had been adjusted again. Slightly. Narrowed this time. Less coverage of the walkway. More focus on the entrance. That was not maintenance. That was correction. Someone realized the angle had been too wide. Someone was trying to limit what was captured. I stood there for a second, hands in my pockets, looking at it like any resident might. Casual, uninterested, then turned and walked back inside without breaking stride. That was the final piece for now. Not proof on its own, but confirmation of behavior. Adjustment after awareness. Reaction after pressure. Back inside, I checked the time again. Less than 24 hours until the meeting. Rebecca would walk into that room expecting control, expecting structure, expecting the same outcome she always got. Ryan would likely be there, not officially, but present enough to reinforce it. And everyone else would expect this to be routine. Another resident. Another violation. Another resolution. That was the assumption holding everything together. And assumptions are only strong until they are tested. I sat down, closed the laptop for the first time all day, and let the quiet settle again, because everything that needed to be collected had been collected, everything that needed to be connected had been connected. From here on, it was not about gathering more. It was about timing. And tomorrow, in that room, at exactly 6 p.m., timing was going to matter more than anything else. At exactly 5:58 p.m., I was already inside the clubhouse conference room, seated at the far end of the table where the light from. The overhead fixture hit just right, not too bright, not too dim, enough to see everything clearly without drawing attention to myself. And that placement mattered because position in a room like this always matters more than people think. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind of room designed for decisions that were supposed to feel official even when they were not. I could hear voices approaching down the hallway before the door opened, Rebecca's tone leading, controlled, confident, already setting the rhythm before she even stepped inside. She walked in first, clipboard in hand like always, followed by two other board members who looked more like observers than participants, and a few seconds later, Ryan appeared near the doorway, not sitting, not speaking, just present, leaning slightly against the wall like he belonged there without needing a reason. That was deliberate. Reinforcement without involvement. I watched all of it without reacting, letting them settle into their roles, because that is what this was to them. A routine. A structure they had run before. Rebecca took her seat at the head of the table, placed the clipboard down with a soft, precise motion, and looked directly at me with that same composed expression. "Let us begin," she said, voice steady, professional, like this was already under control. She outlined the violation in the same vague language as before, referencing community standards, compliance expectations, potential penalties, building a narrative that sounded complete without ever providing anything concrete. The other board members nodded occasionally, not questioning, just following along, because when something is presented with enough confidence, it rarely gets challenged. When she finished, she looked at me, expecting the usual response. Explanation. Defense. Maybe even apology. I did none of that. I reached into my folder and placed a single printed page on the table, sliding it forward just enough for the light to catch it. Not a stack, not a presentation, just one page. "Before we continue," I said, calm, even, controlled, "I would like to clarify the sequence of events." That was all. No accusation, no emotion, just sequence. Rebecca's eyes flicked down to the page, then back up to me, and for the first time, there was a pause, small, almost invisible, but enough to register. "This is a standard review," she replied, trying to maintain control, redirecting back to her structure, but the rhythm had already shifted. I did not interrupt her. I let her finish that sentence, because timing matters, and then I spoke again. "The system log shows a manual override on my access key at 3:42 p.m., I said, tapping the page lightly, not aggressively, just enough to anchor the point. The denial occurred at 3:57 p.m. The notice was issued at 7:12 p.m., and the administrative permissions were adjusted at 12:14 p.m. today. The room went quiet. Not loud silence. Not dramatic. Just that subtle shift when information does not fit the expected script. One of the board members leaned forward slightly, eyes moving to the page, trying to process what they were seeing. Rebecca did not look down this time. She kept her eyes on me, but her posture changed, just a fraction, shoulders tightening, grip on the clipboard adjusting. That was the moment control started to slip. Ryan shifted near the doorway, not stepping forward, but no longer relaxed either, his attention sharpening, because now this was no longer routine. "Those details are internal," Rebecca said, her tone still controlled, but tighter now, more deliberate, like she was choosing each word carefully. "They are not relevant to this review." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but not agreeing with it. "They are directly relevant," I said, same calm tone, same steady pace. "Because they establish that the restriction occurred before any formal determination of violation." I let that sit for a second, not pushing, not adding more, just letting the sequence exist in the room. One of the board members looked at Rebecca now, not at me, and that shift mattered more than anything that had been said so far. Attention had moved. Authority was no longer one direction. Rebecca finally glanced down at the page, just briefly, but it was enough. The moment someone looks at the evidence instead of controlling the conversation, the structure changes. Ryan took a small step forward, not speaking, but closer now, like he was preparing to intervene if needed, but still holding back, because he did not yet know how this was going to unfold. And that was the point. For the first time since this started, they were no longer certain. I sat back slightly, hands resting on the table, completely still, because I did not need to say anything else yet. The sequence was already there. The pattern was already visible. And the more they tried to control it, the clearer it was going to become. Rebecca had built this system on confidence, on assumption, on the belief that no one would ever lay it out in a way that could not be ignored. But now it was laid out, simple, clean, undeniable. and the room had already started to change. No one spoke for a few seconds, and in a room like that, silence is not empty. It is pressure building in real time, shifting from one side to the other, and I could feel exactly when it stopped belonging to Rebecca. One of the board members cleared his throat softly, eyes still on the paper, then looked up at her instead of at me. And that was the moment everything changed, not because of what was said, but because of who it was directed at. "Can you explain this sequence?" he asked, careful, not confrontational, but no longer passive. Rebecca did not answer right away, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where she had to think instead of react, said more than anything she could have said out loud. "Administrative actions are handled internally," she replied finally, her tone still controlled, but there was a difference now, a slight edge where there had been none before. "They are part of enforcement procedures." I watched the room, not her, because reactions tell the truth faster than words, and I saw it, the uncertainty spreading, subtle, quiet, but real. People who had walked in expecting a routine review were now looking at something they did not fully understand, and when people do not understand something, they start asking questions. That is when structures begin to weaken. "Before any violation was confirmed?" the same board member asked, leaning forward slightly, and Rebecca's grip tightened on the clipboard again, that same small tell she had not realized she was repeating. Ryan shifted near the wall, stepping a little closer now, no longer just a presence, but still silent, because this was not his space to control, not officially, and that limitation was starting to show. I reached into my folder again and placed a second page on the table, sliding it next to the first, aligning them carefully so the timeline extended cleanly from one to the other. "There are additional entries," I said, calm, measured, no change in tone, because escalation in voice would only reduce clarity, and clarity was everything right now. "Multiple instances over the past 90 days where access was restricted prior to formal review, followed by notices that reference compliance after the fact." I did not look at Rebecca when I said it. I let the information exist in the room on its own. One of the other board members picked up the page, scanning it slowly, his expression shifting from neutral to focused, then to something else entirely. Recognition, not of the full picture yet, but of enough to know this was not isolated. Rebecca exhaled slowly, just once, controlled, but it was the first visible break in rhythm. "If there are concerns about administrative processes, those can be addressed separately," she said, trying to redirect again, trying to pull the conversation back into a structure she could manage, but it was too late for that. The structure had already moved. "This is the process," I replied, still calm, still steady. "The restriction, the notice, the review. It is all part of the same sequence." I let that sit, because forcing the conclusion is never as effective as letting others reach it themselves. The first board member leaned back slightly, looking from the pages to Rebecca, then briefly toward Ryan, and that glance mattered, because it acknowledged his presence in a space where he did not officially belong. "Why is law enforcement involved in a community access issue?" he asked, not accusing, just asking, but the question itself changed everything. Ryan straightened, stepping away from the wall, his posture shifting from casual to formal, but he still did not speak immediately, because now any word he chose would carry weight beyond what he intended. Rebecca opened her mouth to answer, then stopped, recalibrating, because this was no longer a simple narrative she could control. And that was the moment I had been waiting for, not the reveal, not yet, but the collapse of certainty. I placed one final item on the table, not a document this time, but my identification, sliding it forward with the same controlled motion as before, no emphasis, no announcement, just placement. "My name is Ethan Cole," I said, voice even, steady, unchanging. "And I am here in an official capacity that requires accurate documentation of administrative and enforcement practices." I did not raise my voice. I did not add anything else. I did not need to. The room went completely still, not the quiet from before, but something heavier, something that settled in all at once as the information connected. Rebecca's eyes dropped to the identification, then back to me, and for the first time since this began, there was no control left in her expression, just realization. Ryan did not move, but his posture changed again, sharper now, more aware, because he understood exactly what that meant even if the others did not fully yet. The board members looked between us, the pages, the identification, the pieces finally aligning into something they could not ignore or explain away. I sat back slightly, hands resting calmly on the table, because at this point, there was nothing left to push. The system had already revealed itself. The sequence had already been established. And the moment they understood that this was no longer just a resident sitting across from them, everything they thought they controlled stopped being theirs to manage. Rebecca had used the system to close a gate on me. Now that same system had opened something she could not close. And there was no way back from that.